I hope you can see the images. It's a bit light in here, but I think you get the idea. I'm going to be talking about China on the pantomime stage, and I've condensed this into looking at representations of Aladdin, which is the best known pantomime with regard to China. Aladdin comes from the Arabian Nights. The first English translation of the Arabian Nights was published in 1718. It wasn't until 50 years after this that it was adapted for the stage by John O'Keeffe at Covent Garden in 1788, the story of Aladdin or the Wonderful Lamp. Aladdin on the London stage would grow in popularity even whilst adapting to increasingly negative ideas about China throughout the 19th century. Right from the very beginning of the pantomime, Anglo-Chinese relations and politics were bound up in the scripting of the story. For example, O'Keeffe alludes to the English passion for porcelain, ascribing it to women. We've just heard about how Chinoiserie wallpaper was used in women's rooms. Chinoiserie was associated with women, and so in the script of this pantomime, it's recommended to buy British. Now, the English manufacturers had perfected the process of making chinaware. Porcelain was called China because it came from China. So the script goes, "And why abroad our money fling to please our fickle fair? No more from China bring, here's English chinaware." The costumes in the pantomimes were a combination of Chinese, Japanese, and Persian styles, and similarly inaccurate costumes have been used in performances ever since. Here's an image of one which you can see doesn't look particularly Chinese to our eyes. This comes from an 1813 production staged at Covent Garden, in which the young Aladdin comes to rule over a land called Grand Tartary. So this was a way of dealing with the confusing ethnic demands of this being an Arabian Nights story, but set in China. So Badrul Badur is the daughter of a Cham of Tartary. The vast Central Asian territories of the Mongol rulers of the 13th century provided a credible location for this story that includes foreign rulers of Chinese cities, grand viziers, Chinese slaves, and all sorts of fanciful versions of Eastern costumes, which still had a hold on fashionable society in London. So in this production, the African magician of the original becomes Abanazar, and the name of Aladdin's mother here is the widow Ching Mustafa, so that's a slightly sinicized version of her Arabic name. A revival of this version was staged at Covent Garden in 1826 as a grand romantic spectacle, and at Easter again, the fairy opera of Aladdin was put on at Drury Lane. So at this time, these were just opportunities to show visual splendor, displays of gauzily robed ballet girls. It was said to be a vehicle for the appearance of a host of dancers in diaphanous Oriental gowns, whilst Aladdin and his playmates were played by actresses in tights. They were referred to as fairy extravaganzas. They had no critical purpose. They were just whimsical entertainments composed of pointless puns and silly jingles. So they still sustain this vision, a kind of Rococo vision of the Orient, which was a leftover or hangover from 18th century Chinoiserie. They did, the comedy was a sort of malicious confusion of burlesque, and these were the originals from which the modern pantomime, which we recognise as Aladdin, is descended. Henry Fielding, the author of Tom Jones, describes burlesque as what is monstrous and unnatural, and where our delight arises from the surprising absurdity, as in appropriating the manners of the highest to the lowest, or a converso, back to front. So Chinoiserie gives us this kind of world, an absurd world with which to poke fun. The popular folk image of Orientals doing everything back to front would become a comic staple of pantomime. Even though the Renaissance voyages of discovery had disproved some of the more fabulous mythologies about the opposite side of the globe, it was still the topsy-turviness of affairs in those parts which caught the attention of early commentators. So the China of Aladdin offered a mirror reversal of the proper way of being, and its topsy-turvy world provided a means of social commentary. The socially mixed audiences of London's theatres could appreciate the downfall of an emperor and a penniless boy gaining a palace and a princess. But as the 19th century progressed, the stage as a bastion of 18th century Chinoiserie would survive imperialist disenchantment with China. Public opinion began to be informed by reports of the successful prosecution of the Opium Wars. So pantomime representations of China no longer discovered there an ideal burlesque locale in which to play out contemporary political concerns, but rather in the ways of its people, a butt for burlesque buffoonery. It was after the Opium Wars that hostile images of China began to be reflected on the pantomime stage. It didn't go unnoticed in Punch magazine, so this was included as a kind of small ad under a column heading Promotions and Changes, and it read, "The band of Richardson's theatre to be beef-eaters instead of Chinese mandarins, of which the dresses are at last worn out." So this was a comment on a kind of overload of chinoiserie, but still China and Aladdin continued to be popular in the theatre. Now, though, it was the Chinese characters began to be poked fun at. Aladdin and his wonderful lamp, or the Genie of the Ring, was performed in 1856 at the Royal Princesses Theatre in Oxford Street. And in this production, the Princess Badroulbadour was a young lady, some 7 feet high, acted very cleverly by a Mr. Daly on stilts. And the review of this said, "We like a burlesque in which bombastic characters and language are ludicrously shown up. The popular fairy tale of Aladdin is a fit subject." And then depictions of the Chinese in Punch and in the political press began to mimic the style of illustrations that accompanied Aladdin's scores in the books that were handed out, so that audiences could follow the songs. So here you have a drawing of Abanazar on one side, and here's something very similar in an anti-Chinese pamphlet on the other side. Thomas de Quincey, who was very much behind prosecuting the Opium Wars, he resorted to theatrical allusion when he referred to the Chinese as vile burlesques of intellectual humanity. So from the mid-19th century onwards, the image of the Chinaman was inseparable from his pantomime representation, while the reality of China was thought quite as ludicrous as its stage counterpart. Nevertheless, through the 1860s and 70s, gaudy chinoiserie design was used to design the theatres and music halls as well as the productions on stage, and continued to enthrall London's theatre-goers right into the 20th century. Meanwhile, derogatory characteristics were more increasingly bound up in the presentation of these characters. So in the year following China's humiliation in the Opium Wars, Aladdin began to form the form that we recognise today, with H.J. Byron's Aladdin or the Wonderful Scamp, an original burlesque extravaganza, which opened on April Fool's Day, same day as today, in 1861. This was to prove the definitive Aladdin. Here we have the man cast in the role of Aladdin's mother and a female principal boy, and the trend for actresses to show their legs in tights in higher and higher costumes. So here we have versions of Widow Twankey, and then some images of different Victorian beauties playing Aladdin as a boy. It was Byron who altered her name from Ching Mustafa or Widow Souchong to the indestructible widow Twankey. There became a trend for characters in Aladdin pantomimes to be named after types of tea, and this again is significant of mid-Victorian attitudes towards China. Enthusiasm being tempered with hostility, there's a certain bewilderment of feeling about the place in the scripts of these periods. To apply the name of a type of tea to a person follows in the burlesque tradition, which lampooned characters by giving them ridiculous names, and at the same time it commodifies and packages the Chinese characters in the way that tea was now being branded and packaged for individual retail. So you have characters Pico, Twankey, Souchong, Bogie and Kongu, all well known to English audiences as varieties of tea. The name Twankey came from a variety of green tea grown in the Tuangqi district of China. It's also said to be a corruption of Ti Kuan Yi, which is an older yield of tea, hence, the age of the widow rather than the young tips. In 1879, Augustus Harris took over the management of Drury Lane, and here we get the beginning of grand pantomime and spectacle, which in its pageantry is a representation of British superiority. So pantomime reaches an apogee of prestige just at the same time of Britain's imperial greatness, and Harris's opulent productions at Drury Lane provided a display of Britannia's greatness with wildly patriotic transformation scenes and processions in which glittering battalions of girls dressed as Eastern beauties feeding Victorian fantasies of the Oriental female. So you have Tartar maidens in amber, silk and furs, girls from Cochin China in creamy robes and feathered headdresses, Laps in white furs, Japanese in embroidered purple, girls from China in terracotta and gold robes. By 1881, Leopold Wagner's book about pantomime describes Aladdin as a lad declared to be obstinate, disobedient and mischievous, and wholly abandoned to indolence and licentiousness. Now this description of Aladdin is nowhere to be found in earlier translations, where Aladdin is just irrepressibly naughty. So the original description of Aladdin is neither good words nor the fear of chastisement were capable of fixing his mercurial genius, which is typical of boys of his age, rather than typical Chinese of late 19th century stereotype, which you get in the other description. In 1885, Harris staged E.L. Blanchard's Aladdin. Blanchard's Aladdin, I don't know if you can see the names up here, demonstrates the inexhaustibility of laughs to be derived from the comic distortion of Chinese into silly sound-alike names. So Mrs. Twankey has yet to acquire her Chinese laundry. She runs a newspaper shop. She has a maid-of-all-work called Cheeky Creature. Then there is Bogie, Demon of the Swamp, Agitati, Leader of the Delegates, and Saucy, Bedroulbadour's Maid of No Work. Another thing that late 19th century English audience assailed with the breakneck progression of scientific achievement would find amusing was the kind of quotation that headed Blanchard's script. That wonderful people, the Chinese, claim to have anticipated all the inventions and discoveries of later times from history of China. So this kind of subverted irony laughed at the idea of a marvellous or mythic Cathay and its supernatural inventions, but the reality of China conveyed by the media was fragile and artificial, just like its decaying Manchu aristocracy, and is generally portrayed as shattered China. So Blanchard's emperor possesses a clockwork blue and white china dog, which, if it should break, bodes tragedy for the flowery land. The spectacular aspects of the Land of the Willow pattern plate endured, but this was now tempered with the disdain necessitated by the ideology of Western Christian supremacy and imperialism. So by the 1880s, Widow Twankey's lines carried a political import in the matter of labour and notions of imported labour. So this is from Blanchard's script. Mrs. Twankey says, that you can build a palace, I don't doubt it, but Chinese coolies take so long about it. And Aladdin replies, might I suggest as labour yields enjoyment, that British workmen here should find employment? None better can you get, search where you will. And she replies, I read that line in some election bill. The merits of the British workmen were aligned with the merits of the British imperial project in the East, where benighted shores were being transformed by the magic of Western ingenuity. So Aladdin demands, building his palace, a good old race, the duty never shirk men, and the genius conjures an army quick of model British workmen. And this cues a procession of navvies, bricklayers, masons, carpenters, painters, gardeners, labourers and carters, a British army that must rest from the demon, the dismal swamp. This is very similar and references the project in Shanghai. Eurocentric historiography maintained that China desperately needed the impact of the West to be transformed into a modern society. So a rub of Aladdin's magic lamp transforms the demon swamp into a fertile plain. And you could read this as an ideological suppression of the British destruction of the summer palace. So here you have myriads of tiny British workmen constructing a beautiful palace with a practicable bridge, which provides a picturesque route for the brilliant procession of Aladdin's retainers. As we move into the 20th century, London's theatres continue to replicate Oriental visions in tinsel, spangles, pasteboard and limelight. So the overtly racist hostility towards China generated in the press gets tempered on the stage by fantasy, an aura of enchantment and frivolity, and a suspended animation of China in this quaint and comic chinoiserie. So China is gorgeous in its timeless antiquity, but ridiculous in the antiquated antics of its Chinese inhabitants. And after the smashing of the summer palace, the reduction of the country to its most famous and fragile project, the shortening of Chinaware to China had become part of the language, is a perennial staple of Aladdin humour. In this cartoon, this is going back a little bit to when Queen Victoria becomes crowned Empress of India, a cartoon shows Disraeli as Ebenezer exchanging her crown for the imperial crown of India, Empress of India. So Aladdin pantomime is like absolutely imbued in English awareness of what China is and English ideas of Chineseness. My last image is from 1909, and 20th century versions of pantomime is a whole other paper. But I'd also just like to finish by saying that this all stems from 18th century chinoiserie, and this is maintained on the stage, but constantly adapting to notions of China as perceived in England, and that continues through the 20th century until today. Okay, thank you.